So you ever meet a guy or a person and you walk away from a brief engagement and you kind of think to yourself, that was just an interesting person. He's like a Renaissance man. You don't meet people like that every day. I have, and I remember the first meeting I had with this person, and he's going to be our keynote today. His name is Sanjay Dahl. I think you'll all find him very interesting as well. Sanjay is the founder of Detroit Flying Cars and Emergent Systems. After departing SDRC, Sanjay launched Emergent Systems to provide innovative new product design, engineering, and product development services for automotive, aerospace, wind energy, and consumer goods. Sanjay is an accomplished inventor and holds numerous patents in the area of aerospace, health, consumer goods, and knowledge management. Sanjay has a lifelong passion for designing, building, and flying models and full-size aircraft. This passion for flying and a desire to bridge the divide between road and air led to Detroit Flying Cars, where he has worked on making the flying car a reality. Sanjay studied business at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, earned a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Toledo, and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. So you see what I mean. He's got a very, very interesting background, and I think you all are going to love his talk today. So, Sanjay?
Good morning. I am obsessed with... Mic is not on? Is it now? Yes. All right. Thank you. I'm obsessed with designing new things. And as long as I can remember, I have wanted to fly. And after coming to Detroit, and pointer. This is the advance, right? The green button. After coming to Detroit and spending the last maybe 25 years here, I came to recognize some remarkable human contradictions. And I've looked at these contradictions through the lens of creating new things, new ideas, breakthrough inventions. And I have always wondered, and my wonderment continues on till today, as to how it is that some in the world tend to be so resourceful and innovative, while others not so much. And so in any case, about 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to embark on my lifelong mission of building a flying car. One that would drive on the road and fly in the sky, giving the ultimate freedom that anybody could choose to experience. And I mean, I had been experiencing freedom in the United States, having been here for the last 30-some years. And this would have been a super United States if I was able to do that. So looking at things through the lens of creating new ideas and new inventions, people, when I would interact with people, people would generally ask, "Why are you doing this?" And I generally didn't have a good answer. The answer is what my kids tell me: because. It's something within you that says that's what you want to do with yourself. And so about 4 years ago, I started physically building the first prototype of this flying car. And the answer about this why business was better answered, and I'll tell you why. In the last several months, things happened that led me to many new revelations about the answers to this puzzle. 50 years ago, this is the 50th anniversary year of the landing on the moon. So Neil Armstrong was asked this question, why are we going to the moon? And he said, I think we're going to the moon because it's in man's nature. We are required to do these things, just like the salmon swim upstream. That's it. There's no more reason than the human desire to do new things. Back in December, during a normal testing that I was doing on the car at the airport at Willow Run, the machine accidentally took off and went into this, the testing I was doing was to have been just ground testing, but it took off, went about 150 feet in the air and then came straight down and struck the ground at 65 miles an hour. And the car was destroyed, and I nearly with it. But it gave me months and months of time during my recovery to think about what happened, to think about what went wrong, and is this the end for me to be working on this project? And so I looked at this setback, and I tried to investigate many questions I had about myself as a person. Am I sane? Am I crazy? Why did I do this when everybody said, don't do it? Am I not a good engineer? Am I not a good decision maker? You question everything. And so I looked back to answers, talking to friends, reading books about others in the past and present times who have tried to create, some successfully, most successfully, some not so much, and looking at the lessons of their successes and failures. And that led to a renewed and refreshing understanding for me on the role of failure in creating breakthrough products. And as I read these things, the first one I ran into was from Henry Ford. He said, failure is the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. Which implied for me, because I was thinking of this as a showstopper, a dead end, nowhere further to go, but to consider yourself hospitalized and done. But the lesson, the simple statement said, it is the time for a new beginning, but this time with the new data you have in hand. And as you read, you come across the writings of Winston Churchill, who during World War II, was successful in evading defeat, and it required a persistent effort in new ways. And he said that success really is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. These are. I find these to be inspiring words, ways for me to get out of bed and start to attempt it again. And then some woman who came across an article here in the last month, in an opinion article was reported as saying the most dangerous place to be for anybody is significantly ahead of the curve. It is a dangerous place. It is a place where there are risks of all different kinds, unknown. And if you choose to be there, just like trying to land on the moon, all in varying shades of the same thing. And then looking back, I read the biography of Ben Franklin, who, I found him to be a fascinating inventor of his own time, 300 years ago. What he had to say about the process of discovering things by trial and error and experimentation, rather than doing trial and error and doing things physically rather than relying on theoretical learning. So this has sort of started me on the course, and it set me on a path to seeing some lessons and putting failure in appropriate place where I believe it belongs in the invention process. I know many of you work for large engineering firms and understand the challenges of product development. You understand them largely from a large organizational standpoint. My vantage point has been from a very small organizational standpoint. In any case, as I continued my readings, I encountered the work of, and this I make references to in the past as well, because I find it admirable, the qualities of engineering as a field of study and a profession, and what the President Herbert Hoover had to say about it. You know, he said that the works of engineers are always out in the open for all to see. The engineer works in methodical step by step towards his goal, and he cannot bury his mistakes like the doctors. He cannot, like the lawyer, argue them or blame the judge. He cannot blame his opponents like politicians. And there are many other comparisons he makes, including the architect who can, he cannot hide his mistakes behind facades of trees like the architect. The engineer simply cannot deny that he did it. If his works, so his works are out in the open for all to see, and if his works do not work, he is damned. This is the reality we all face. You read news of these experiences often on the front pages of newspapers. Now, it may be a little different in the world of firmware and hardware and things of that nature where things can be hidden with code. But that's not what I'm referring to. Now, there are also differences between the way that a product launch failure is experienced by the team versus a launch of a physical product where you can get yourself personally injured. And those are somewhat different experiences. But I got in quite a bit of reaction, many scores of cards of sympathy when this happened. And it sort of tamed the heartbreak that I was experiencing. But I got lots of sweet cards reminding me that, life is still good. And the interesting ones came from children. By the way, I got cards from people, friends, family, and strangers who wrote expressing the sympathy but support for the idea. And one of them was this kid. He's about 15, lives in Chicago, but was very interested in flying cars and wanted to work with me. And so came to visit last summer to help me in doing that. And he helped me for the few weeks he was here. So when he saw this news, he sent me this book with encouragement to keep going. Another was a book from my daughter, which once again talked about the puzzling works of certain crazy inventors, and it was based on Rosie the Riveter, but in this case it was slightly modified. And in any case, this book that this kid sent me from Chicago was the book called, you can see that it's a book on Stoic principles, the writings of Marcus Aurelius, which says that the obstacle is the way. I learned a lot about failure from this book. This book talked about how, and this is perhaps my first example of the contradictions of the human mind as to what matters, what doesn't, and how we react to it. It said that the only thing that we can control is our mind and our actions. We don't have control on the things we think we have control of. We don't have control on our body. We don't have control on our belongings. The only thing you have control on is your mind and your actions. And when you think about it, it really said that if you are able to adopt that mindset, it puts you in a very peaceful state of the present moment. It allows you to accept nature for what it is. It also says that you can, it encourages you to act, take actions while fully recognizing that the outcomes are not in your control, but act anyways. And these are writings from 2,000 years ago, very similar to some of the writings we encounter back in India from the Bhagavad Gita, which say exactly the same thing. That take action irrespective of the fear of the outcomes. And it also sort of anticipates that when adversities come, face them and be prepared for them. But that does not mean necessarily going through, necessarily expecting them all the time. You just have to know they will be present, and when they happen, be prepared to react. And it sort of puts you in a state of mind where whether you have success or failure, you're not surprised or angry that it happened. And this was a wonderful lesson and a starting point in my journey of understanding failure from a new point of view, from a very beyond the veil point of view, if I could say that. So this was sort of the introduction into the Stoic philosophy, which seems in many ways very supportive of the idea of resigning to act, just act, do things, while recognizing that not all things you do will work. It has been a common trait among people we see the world over, and particularly in the United States, who have created some amazing inventions and made the lives better for all of us. But the second contradiction that I experience is the way the world sees success and failure as they look at it from the outside in versus someone who is at the bleeding edge of it. To the world at large, who are the recipients generally of these products that are being created, they see new products coming to market all the time. And so to them, success is commonplace. However, to the inventor, it is the exact opposite. Success is a very hard-earned victory at the end of a massive struggle with a sequence of failures. This is the part that is completely topsy-turvy in the world. It is very hard to convey that discrepancy. Last week, a week and a half ago, India launched the first Lunar mission, and it crash landed on the moon. In the last, it traveled several millions of miles successfully, but crashed after one misfiring of a booster engine in the last mile of it. This made all the headlines. All the usual discussions, particularly with people whose origins lie in that part of the world, were about that failure. So it is a lot like, the hundreds of steps in getting to the moon were never applauded, while the one failure was the source of all the news. From my personal experience, when I was engaging with the Detroit newspapers, they were not interested in covering that the FAA had been involved in certifying this particular project. But when the crash occurred, they were clamoring for coverage and elbowing each other out of the way to cover it. In fact, as part of that, the videos that were posted led to so much criticism. These are, on Facebook and Twitter, etc. They were happy to post all of that. And once again, the emphasis on failure is so great that the hard work of conquering the prior 100 failures are completely vanished from the scene, banished from the scene. So it's an interesting place to be, and the big difference between being on this side of the fence versus that is how you view such things. And let me mention a favorite inventor of mine. That's Burt Rutan. He's the modern day Wright brothers. He had a saying about this. He says that if at least half the world doesn't believe that what you are working on is impossible or crazy, it's not research. It's only development. And it simply conveys the essence that if it is of significance, then the world should not think it possible till it happens. Jeff and I often talk about the failure discussions by the Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter. When he described his struggles to get Twitter launched, people didn't know all of that it took 10 years. And he said, after slogging my ass off for 10 years, I became an overnight success. And that is the nature of perspectives. Another meaningful reading that I came across was from the work of a wonderful modern-day philosopher named Nassim Taleb. He wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. This became very much in vogue after the 2008 financial crisis. And he essentially introduced a term called skin in the game that has become completely business book, textbook material now. But skin in the game, a term where you truly, literally have skin in the game, or you're not involved in a decision making, has a very central role to play in how you make decisions. And he mentions the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and the code of Hammurabi back in 4,000 years ago, which has this specific one, which expresses the idea of what it means to have skin in the game. If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house falls in and kills its owner, then the builder shall be put to death. Now I ask you and the designers of products out there which are in the news today, if that was the law, would you make the decisions you do? The difference is skin in the game. And that is when your ass, is on the line, literally. But for me, taking a break from all of what had been experienced was an important separation to separate out emotions from rational thinking about the failure modes, the causes of the accident that occurred, etc. And to that extent, I find that whenever encountering a failure, my first reaction is to take a short break. This separates out all the defeatist thoughts that happen, and the next morning you're ready to go again. This has been my experience throughout. Looking back at the first jet airplane that de Havilland launched back in 1952, in about 2 years, they started having crashes. In 1954, the de Havilland crashed, and they were able to review that and see what went wrong. This was the first pressurized airplane to have been built and flew above 25,000 feet. And they discovered this was the early beginnings of discovering fatigue analysis from the engineering standpoint. Certain rivets were being pressurized cyclically during every flight and depressurized, leading to an understanding of fatigue failure. Now, the interesting thing that this example was for me, once again, came from an observation by Nassim Taleb, who says that if you really look at your resume, honestly look at your resume, it is a catalog of your failures. And if you don't have a list of failures on your resume, you haven't had significant breakthroughs in your career. It's one way to think about how we learn. David Brooks on NPR said this one day, and I took notes, where he says that you suffer your way to wisdom. In fact, when it happens, it is the best lesson there is to gain anything. I think of it as the best form of inoculating yourself for far greater failures. In fact, that is the brilliance I'm finding about failure. It is the source that prevents far greater catastrophes and the greatest source of learning. Now, one additional example of skin in the game, just the one that is much more visceral, is if you can imagine yourself jumping off that cliff in a hang glider, you must at that moment know what skin in the game means. You know exactly whose rear is on the line should you not act appropriately in landing that thing several thousand feet below. By comparison, the engineers and executives making decisions on any product that is for use in public consumption, how much of their skin was in the game? You can see that very clearly. And it is clear because there are time delays between the time that you call attention to an issue and by the time it becomes a problem. A few months after arriving in the United States, I witnessed this picture on my TV screen. This was the Challenger accident. And it was disheartening to see it. It was disheartening because everything that I had learned about the United States was captured in the lunar landing. So to see something of this nature was, it was a jab to the soul. And investigating this, as you know, led to discoveries. And people found out that there were engineers commenting that to not fly the shuttle that day because of low temperatures. It was ignored due to, guess what? Absence of skin in the game. What this led to for me was to understand when people give you advice, how to accept their advice. How do you know that what they're telling you is simply convention speaking, or they're concerned for you, or they're simply skeptics, cynics, pessimists? How do you know the difference? And this has become central to considering whose input you accept when making decisions in the field of any innovation. And so there is so I came, it's interesting, like I said to you, I look at all of my experiences out there from the lens of creating new things. So I happened to come across a TED Talk from a fellow named Naval Ravikant. He's a Silicon Valley angel investor who's rather remarkable in his insights. He says, partner with people who are optimistic. Don't partner with people or seek the advice from those that are skeptics, cynics, or pessimists. He said the old military rule applies, which is there's only three ways you can be. Either lead, follow, or get out of the way. He says that if there are people who want to create a fourth way, where they neither want to lead, nor want to follow, and nor want to get out of the way, you're not interested in having them on your team. So lean on those people who have a bias for action. I am running behind, aren't I? Now, I have also found that there is not a wasted failure on planet Earth. Every failure, if you should choose to search through Google, every failure has had a positive outcome, which is why I say that failure is your least painful outcome. So here's what happened after the same the Challenger accident. And this is the result of me I obsessively read obituaries, looking for insights into the lives of interesting people. This happened a month ago when a fellow named Gary Burrell passed away. Gary Burrell worked at King Radio, which was a subcontractor to NASA on the Challenger project. And when the Challenger accident occurred, guess what happened? Funding was eliminated for the Challenger and for all space shuttles for a while. He was essentially out of a job. Gary, along with Min Kao, another engineer, started a company called Garmin and continued the work that was interrupted by the accident to create GPS systems. And that's Garmin, the company today, the result of a failure. No failure is ever a waste. That is my conclusion on that. And just one other note on the contradictions of people's understanding. We all recognize that mankind has this propensity to create new things. But when new things are created by someone, our ability to recognize the value for it is zero. When the Wright brothers in 1903 first had their flight, 57 seconds long, the newspapers were not interested in publishing it. Nothing appeared in the Dayton paper because they said, that's not news. Come back to us when it's 57 minutes long. Well, in 1908, 5 years after the original invention had come out, the US government was still not persuaded that there was any use for airplanes. And the first persuaded attempt to have the government purchase the Wright brothers' airplane was accompanied by a test flight where someone something's named in Detroit about him, Lieutenant Selfridge, was to be the first passenger on a Wright brothers airplane. And that flight ended badly. And the flight crashed, and that was the first fatality from a passenger on a... Well, that put the kibosh on the US government buying that airplane. However, investigation of that led to something that is very relevant to us at this conference. Examination of the wreckage showed that the propeller had been nicked and had a crack in it. There had not been, up to that point, a system of pre-flighting an airplane before every launch, before every takeoff. After that, Wilbur Wright started a checklist. And that checklist, started in 1908, is the basis of so much quality improvement in today's products, the result of a crash. So most of the time, when you're in the invention state, I'm 140 over. Let me take 5 more minutes and wrap it up. Expecting the unexpected is what is learned from the Stoic philosophy I mentioned to you earlier. But that is the protocol for invention. When you're doing new products, that's what you have to be ready for. And it's just a smart-ass picture of the sword of Damocles. So there are many questions, and these questions I have asked myself over and over have been differences of degree, and nobody has been able to help me answer them. So you have to seek out answers which sort of interpolate between the facts that you see in the world. So typically, you know that there is risk involved when you do new things. But what is the level of that risk? How far should you be sticking your neck out before that happens? And you simply can't tell by looking how dangerous something is. So you can only say that you have to expect possible things, so approach it with caution. But how precisely one can do that is not, it is only short steps, and the lessons from previous people that have gone before that would tell us that. So this balance of when to trust someone's advice, when not to trust it, how much risk is too much risk, there's no metrics for it. And every failure will catch you by surprise. Exactly like Pearl Harbor, the tranquil settings of Hawaii were broken, and nobody knew what to do in that moment. And that happens to be the human mind's contradictory state. We are as aware as we are that these things can happen. When they happen, our preparation can sometimes be. But this is the challenge of breakthrough technologies. And therein lies a lesson for Detroit. While you suffer through traffic jams and go to work in Detroit, there has to be a realization that there is a potential threat out there. What it is and how a large organization to react to it is a challenge, and one that large organizations historically don't face well. Yesterday's newspaper, I understand, had the news of Thomas Cook going under. 150-year-old company, successful till then. These challenges are very hard at large organizations, and I call this the incumbency challenge because they are so tied to the present. And I have struggled to figure out if it's possible for large organizations. Ron Messick back there was sharing with me some of the sloppy controls that exist. Very gross forms of, redirecting a battleship, to turn around or make, directional changes. It's very hard for large organizations. So when this has to happen, these are questions that large organizations have to truly think about and say, how do you expect Pearl Harbor to be avoided in Detroit? And so while the lesson is that you have to be patient, not necessarily chase deadlines. The lesson for me was that chasing a deadline led to my haste in launching that day. But old several hundred-year lesson is that for he who fights and runs away may live to fight another day. But he who is in battle slain can never rise and fight again. The idea is not to run away, but the idea is to have the opportunity to fight again. And these, once again, remind you of the uncertainties lurking just behind, just beyond, and for us to know that they exist. And it's like the ambush that the wildlife experiences, and we are part of the same. We are offsprings from that same wildlife. And I tend to look at nature for answers to everything because I find that we have come from nature, are part of nature, but our social conditions today where if the weather map says that it's not going to rain today and it rains, you cuss your phone out. And not realizing that uncertainty is the default condition. It is the prevailing rule in nature. And we simply have to remind ourselves to go back to that. So it comes to balance and thinking versus doing. I have personally always had a bias towards doing rather than thinking. I don't mean unplanned, but that does require a certain understanding. And the key difference is, and this is the lesson from nature. I'll skip through some of this now, but I'm sorry I've taken so long. Is that you can't plan to avoid failure, but you can plan for failure, which means when it happens, you're like a stand-up comedian. You know how to react when it happens. So it is the difference between planning and recognizing the need to improvise. The other lesson I've learned is to not be a lone ranger, to do things with a team. However, the team does not mean a government-funded project. It means a small, tight team of few like-minded people. This is a picture from one of the inventions of Burt Rutan, who won the X Prize, the Ansari X Prize back in 15 years ago for building the first spaceship on a shoestring budget. And this has led to the Virgin Galactic next generation from it, all from about a handful of people in a hangar. And so, there's a Jeff Bezos example of the appropriate size of a team. He calls it the 2-pizza rule. I think you may have heard that one. That's a common one. He says that have a team only big enough that can be fed by 2 pizzas. So I'll wrap this up very quickly here. I'm sorry I'm belaboring some things. But the closest analogy I have been able to come up with the invention process is climbing a mountain blindly. You have blindfolders and you have to climb a mountain because you do not know what lies ahead. You do not know when you've reached the peak. You do not know that this is a dead end. So the question that always has bothered me is, how do I know that what I'm attempting to do is a dead end? And what I've come to conclude from this is that there is no dead end. And I'll explain in just the next second here. And this is where another writing from Mr. Edison says that our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is to try just one more time. I keep that very close to heart, but this question still bothers me. And when you look at nature, it has the answers. No innovation project has ever gone on a straight line. It is exactly like the meander of a river. And a book came out last weekend by Mark Randolph. He was the founder and CEO of Netflix. If you read that story, you discover what they began with and why that was a failed idea. The book that was called That Will Never Work was a book about renting video cassettes back in '98. How could that idea, such a silly, outdated idea, turn into such a successful company and part of the FANG group of companies? Because there are no dead ends. Because, as they call it in Silicon Valley, that you have to pivot and find the next place, the next hill to climb if one hill is at an end. And you have nowhere further to go with it. This, I found, was a very reassuring sign that there are no dead ends, that when you encounter a strategy that doesn't work, do as Netflix did. They tried several other strategies which also failed, by the way, till they uncovered the one that did work, which you know. And so I rely on nature, and I call it the ultimate improviser. 2 years ago, you may recall there was all sorts of news about the Ebola virus. You remember that? There was so much crisis in Africa, and some of that came to the American shores, and many people died here as well. But you know what that led to? It led to the Ebola virus dying out with the host, the human being. I came across a news on NPR that said the Ebola virus had mutated to a less virulent form so that it didn't kill the host. And it allowed it to survive along with the host. Now, there are strains of this that may be proliferating now, and the Ebola virus epidemics have not been as bad lately. I don't know the causes or effects, but it was a very interesting fact that nature, too, is constantly in a state of improvising. We are part of that same nature. We come from it. And so the lesson that I have from my own question and answer and soul searching has been that failure is a catalyst. It is your fastest way to learning. Failure is a friend, and the more quickly we become friends with failure, we will find that we will be on to creating breakthrough inventions. So instead of, I've seen many, I shared with you some of the writings from various authors, but this is my own. I think about failure as a rest stop, only a rest stop on a longer road trip, a cross-country trip of innovation. Thank you. I'm sorry I took an hour longer.
I'm going to talk real fast. So I think we all admire people who fail and then turn that into success. And for people to do it in such a, a public way shows, some vulnerability that I think we all really admire. And also humility is something else. And for Sanjay to come up here and center his talk around failures instead of some of his awesome successes, I think is really inspirational. So Sanjay, thank you very much.